People who watch my channel will know that I'm a big fan of sci-fi as a genre, and one of my favourite shows of all time was Farscape, a joint US-Australian production that kicked off way back in 1999. One day I'm going to do a proper review of the show because there's a fuck ton I want to say about it, but the general premise is that a US astronaut named John Crichton gets accidentally shot through a wormhole during the test flight for an advanced new spacecraft and ends up on the far side of the galaxy. Pretty soon he hooks up with a small collection of criminals, renegades and deposed leaders who have hijacked a living biomechanical ship named Moya. They start out as enemies, but soon they're forced to work together to escape from an aggressive military empire who ironically call themselves the Peacekeepers. And gradually they form a kind of strained, temperamental friendship as Crichton searches for a way home. The big ensemble cast allowed the writers to explore a bunch of different story ideas, backstories and unusual predicaments, often presenting the audience with complex, morally ambiguous situations and characters. And believe me, the show didn't always have a happy ending. There's easily a dozen different episodes I could point to for their gripping storylines, excellent character work or sheer emotional impact, but the episode that manages to combine all three into basically a perfect self-contained story has got to be Different Destinations, the 5th episode of season 3. And I love it so fucking much that I just have to talk about it here. The story begins with John and the gang on a peaceful world that was once the site of an epic battle between a small force of peacekeeper soldiers defending a besieged hospital and a much larger enemy army determined to take it. According to the official memorial that's been set up there, a peacekeeper officer named Dacon was eventually able to broker a truce with the enemy at the cost of his own life, preventing the battle from spilling over into a much larger conflict. Erin, once a peacekeeper herself, considers Dacon to be a hero amongst her people. Unfortunately, some unintended time travel shenanigans causes the group to get accidentally transported back to the middle of the siege. Before they know it, they're caught up in events that took place hundreds of years earlier. But their very presence there has the unintended effect of altering history, saving Dacon from getting killed like he was supposed to, but also preventing the truce he was meant to broker. As a result, the planet in the future gradually transforms from a peaceful world into a barren, irradiated wasteland as different versions of the timeline start to play out. So the episode kind of centres around the group's efforts to get things back on track and find a way to return to the present. But the more time they spend there, the more they learn about the true nature of the conflict and the people involved in it, and the more it begins to influence their decisions. Crichton, true to his nature, tries to find a peaceful solution that allows everyone to walk away from it in one piece, while Erin, always the warrior, wants to use their superior weaponry to fend off the enemy and force a ceasefire on their terms. And what's so fucking great about this episode is that neither one of them is strictly right or wrong here. Their decisions are based on their different experiences and views of the world, and perfectly line up with everything we know about their characters. On the one hand, Erin's motivated by her loyalty to the Peacekeeper cause and her growing bond with Dacon, which slowly evolves over the course of the episode. Far from being the brave, heroic officer he was made out to be, Dacon turns out to be a lowly cook. Not much more than a kid, really, completely inexperienced in battle and definitely not a hero. For Erin, it starts out as a major disappointment when she comes face to face with the mundane reality of a man who's been venerated as practically a saint in her culture.
Sub Officer Dakin stood right up there. The device says right up there. Guts pouring out everywhere, bleeding, and yet he still managed to initiate the peace process to save the nurse.
It's also a pretty cool way of exploring the gap between the neat, sanitised version of history we often get fed and the much more complicated, ambiguous reality behind it. But the more she comes to know him, the more he's revealed to be a decent, compassionate man, doing his best in difficult circumstances. He might not be the hero she grew up believing in, but he's a good person who deserves to live, and as time passes, Erin develops an almost maternal protectiveness towards him. I love how fucking cool she is when she finds him mishandling a weapon he's clearly never used.
Dacon, slowly take your finger off the trigger and point the weapon away from both of us.
Crichton, on the other hand, makes contact with a captured enemy general, and far from being the barbaric savage that history portrayed him as, he's actually a logical, pragmatic leader, explaining his people are running out of water and desperately need to capture the river in this area to prevent a much larger war. Crichton's attempt to free the man so he can get his troops to stand down goes horribly wrong when one of the nurses kills the general in cold blood, further damaging the timeline. Basically, everything Crichton does to avoid bloodshed only seems to make the situation worse, pushing them further and further towards disaster, until finally, there's only one option left.
He's not a soldier.
I know that. But the way history unfolds, that doesn't stop him from taking an arrow.
I can't state enough how perfectly this one scene brings together all the ideas and character arcs of this episode. The inevitability of a young man with his whole life ahead of him, unknowingly going to his death, watched by the very people who did everything they could to prevent it. Crichton, defeated and imprisoned, resigned to the sacrifice that has to be made for the greater good. And Erin, whose understanding and respect for the man changed and evolved so many times throughout the episode, finally accepting him for who he really is, and saying her last goodbye.
Sub-Officer Dakin. You are a soldier. A brave hero.
For such a strict, disciplined character who doesn't form attachments easily and rarely shows much emotion even in the worst situations, watching her struggle to keep her composure here and gently encourage him to take that final step, it hits like a fucking sledgehammer. But even with all that, the episode still isn't done with you. Dakon's sacrifice isn't enough to stop the enemy making one final attack, forcing the group to resort to Erin's plan and make their last stand. Then fuck me, you can tell how bad she wants to kill all of them here. And after a desperate battle, they finally succeed in driving the enemy back. By the time the dust is settled, Crichton and the others are able to return to a future where global war has been prevented and the timeline restored. Well, more or less. Fuck me, talk about a dark ending, man. Whatever its faults, Farscape is a show that was always willing to take risks, portraying its characters as flawed, damaged people doing their best, but definitely not always succeeding, and Season 3 really went all in with this idea. Several major characters died over the course of the season, and while their deaths were all handled brilliantly, I don't think any of them hit quite as hard as this particular episode. Different Destinations accomplishes so much in such a short space of time, offering up so many different ideas and perspectives, giving each of its characters an emotionally satisfying arc, and leaving you feeling exhausted by the end. It's the kind of writing that you so rarely get these days. Even supporting players like Stark and Dargo get fantastic scenes with great payoffs at the end, whether it's Dargo bonding with a frightened young girl and encouraging her to carve her name on a wall so she'll be remembered, or Stark comforting a woman who knows she could be dead within a matter of hours.
Should the worst befall, you will not be alone.
This isn't about miraculously saving people against impossible odds. It's about flawed, imperfect characters doing what they can to make the end easier when it comes. I watched this episode when I was a fucking teenager, and rewatching it today, it hit just as hard 20 years later. And believe me, there's not many shows that can do that. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.